Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Untangling Alzheimer's and Dementia, a podcast from AlzAuthors. I'm Christy Byrne Yates, and I am an Alz author. And my book is called Building a Legacy of Love, Thriving in the Sandwich Generation. And I'm here with my colleagues, Marianne Sciucco, and Marianne's book is Blue Hydrangeas, an Alzheimer's love story. And I'm also here with Jean Lee, who is the author of Alzheimer's Daughter. So we have lots of representation from our team, and we're here to interview a new book author that we're bringing into our AlzAuthors family. And that's Eliezer Sobel, the author of The Silver Lining of Alzheimer's, One Son's Journey into the Mystery, which is a really intriguing title, and we will ask him about that also. But I want to say welcome, Eliezer, and welcome to the AlzAuthors family.
Thank you, and thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're delighted, and we want to dive in and talk to you a little bit. So I kind of started with the title, but maybe you can tell us first a little bit about yourself and how you came to write your book.
Oh boy, when you're 73, that could take 5 days. I was living in Virginia with my wife, who played a huge role in the story. It wasn't me taking care of my parents, it was she and I. We were driving in a car in Long Island after a 7-day retreat. We were in good spirits, and we got that fateful phone call that everybody dreads from my brother up in Newburyport, Boston, saying that dad was in the NICU, the neurology intensive care unit. He had fallen backward down the stairs and landed on his head and had a traumatic brain injury. And to back up, he was 90, and up until that time, for the previous 17 years or so, he had been my mom's, sole care manager. Originally, he was her sole caregiver, doing everything. And it killed him, and it killed us to watch and listen to him try to do everything, like getting her dressed in the morning in the bathroom. It sounded like we were listening in on, you know, a major martial arts competition, because she was screaming and yelling and pulling his hair. And poor guy, 90, is trying to handle all this. And it took my brother and I 2 years to convince him to allow a stranger into the house.
And your mother had Alzheimer's, is that
I'm
correct?
sorry. Yeah, she ended up, if you add it all up, with a 20-year. She had it for
Wow.
20 years, which is a long time, and we all, especially my dad, wanted to keep her at home. I was remembering, maybe I put it in the book, when they were younger, in their late 70s, maybe they took a tour of local facilities just in case, and they came back they couldn't believe all the old people in there.
Mm-hmm.
They were 79 by then, and they made a vow to each other never to put the other one in a facility. So my dad felt bound to that vow, and he also wanted to keep her home. I mean, they were married almost 70 years by the end.
At 90, your father falls and resulting in a traumatic brain injury.
So yeah, Sherry and I we lived in Virginia. We happened to be in New Jersey because it was the Christmas holiday. And I got the call from my brother. We just took the next turn and drove straight to the NICU. And um, it was one of the longest nights of my life, because my dad had become conscious, but they couldn't sedate him because it was a brain injury. They didn't want to mess with his brain.
Sure.
He was in a bed with railings that he would not stop trying to escape and climbing over, until they had to restrain his entire body, legs, torso, upper shoulders and arms. And I was standing, inches from his face, and he's just pleading with me, "El, why are you so close? You're standing there. Why can't you help me? Why won't you untie me?" And I just thought to myself, he'll tire himself out and fall asleep. But he was up for 12 hours fighting and pleading with me, unable to explain because he couldn't grasp it. So that was tough.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah. So kind of moving it along, your dad's been your mom's caregiver, then her care manager, and now he's going to need care.
Sherry and I moved into my parents'
Ah,
house that night. And
wow.
we never again returned to our 25 or 23-year life in Virginia, friends, community, jobs. We just never literally went back except for one weekend to sign with a realtor. It was
My goodness. My
so
goodness.
overnight I'm living in my childhood home
Right.
with my wife, taking care of two parents.
Yeah,
It was quite a shock to the system.
it
Mm.
is.
Talk about being the unexpected caregiver.
Yeah.
What did you find to be the most daunting in those early days?
Well, the days seemed interminable because, you know, my father and mother usually would wake up at 7ish, and the aides were there to get them moving and get them eventually down to the living room where they would sit in these chairs. But there was a lot of activity around that and breakfast, and Sherry and I had to make sure things were being done right and women were getting along, and there was a whole dynamic in the household. And
Mm.
the last aide at night would go home at around 9 o'clock because my dad didn't want an overnight person at that point. Sherry and I would just collapse on the couch in the living room, flip the TV on, but not really watch. We were just like 24/7 exhausted because we were
Mhm.
on and
Yeah.
interacting and managing nonstop.
So,
That was daunting.
yeah, it sure
Yeah.
sounds like it. And I want to ask in a minute here how you came to write the book, but I guess I'd like to ask Jean. Jean, you as an acquisitions editor, and for I think we've talked about this on podcasts before, but all of our books are very carefully edited, and we have acquisitions editors who read every word of a submitted book, and we are really looking for well written stories about a dementia journey from a personal perspective. So, Jean, I want you to tell us a little bit about what you read and felt in reading Eliezer's book.
So, Eliezer's book is one of more than 400 that we've brought into AlzAuthors. And I love reading these books because I feel that every person's book I read has traveled some part of my own journey, and we have a sisterhood or a brotherhood together. So when Eliezer contacted us about his book, it looked through the submission as though it could be a good fit for us. And I asked him to mail it to me, which he did. And I read it cover to cover and was very moved. For me, when I read for AlzAuthors, I'm looking for the personal story of how how a caregiver survived this. I'm not looking for numbers or stages or drug names or anything like that. I'm looking for the personal story. And so after I read it, I reached back out to Eliezer to invite him. And I'm actually going to read to you what I wrote to him about how I would like him to direct his essay. And I said, Eliezer, I found it very impactful that you wrote so honestly about how you and your dad were very different in your organizational skills and your drive for financial security. To see you immediately abandon your almost post-hippie lifestyle, realize that your parents' finances were running thin, and grapple to gain the financial skills that your dad still maintained into his 90s, created a sense of pure panic and urgency within me as your reader. You gave it all for your parents because they had given it all for you, all of your life. Your book is a true love story between you and your parents. I fell in love with your wife as well and her dedication to your parents. And so it's a
Wow.
beautiful book, complete honesty. You held nothing back, Eliezer.
Thanks.
Yeah.
We should probably interview you about the book because you're a little more familiar with it now than I am. It's funny because in my mind, it's primarily a book about my mother and I and what happened there. but you focused in on my father, who doesn't come in until near the last third of the book. But I'll address that since that's what you brought up. My dad was a famous math educator who published 60 textbooks from pre-K through postgraduate, translated into multiple languages, and he was a nationally known speaker, author, educator. People would come flock to his events, and there'd be standing room only. All this to say, he was no dummy, but his organizational method, which I'm sure he knew exactly what he was doing, but for someone to come into his office when he was not there, which he wasn't, and to realize he has 8 aides, and each of them had a different pay grade, a different pay day. They were being paid using 4 different checking accounts, and their schedules were and phone numbers were scribbled on various pieces of paper. And I had to look at all this, see how much they were each getting. And, I had to work to condense it into one payday. I couldn't quite change their salaries overnight, but I tried to organize it, make it simple. I put all his bills on auto pay, which he was still licking a stamp and mailing everything in. And then there were 4 CDs and IRAs at 4 different banks. So I was working with 8 banks, and pretty much most of my life, I had a piggy bank, the equivalent of a piggy bank. I didn't know the difference between an IRA and a 401k or the financial terms. I had no idea what any of it was. Now I'm very skilled. One of the first things I noticed when I looked at his finances is that he raised us with the idea that there was plenty of money to do whatever we want. Money's no object. He was constantly giving us money and gifting us money, which was tax free, and that number kept raising. And we had grown accustomed to living on a fairly substantial gift every year. And I looked at his finances, and my first move was to cut myself off. I said, Dad can't afford to keep gifting me because we spent $162,000 last year just on aids, not counting all the other household expenses. And his money wasn't going to, doing that wouldn't last many more years. So I had to take me out of immediately. And slowly, with Sherry's help, she's misorganized. So she helped me with spreadsheets and just setting everything up so that it could eventually work without us there. But one thing one of you asked me that reminded me, I was all my life when I had to fill out an insurance form or any legal document and they wrote occupation or taxes, I would write writer/editor. And while I was working with my parents, I was doing my taxes, and under occupation, without even thinking, I wrote caregiver. And then I stopped short and I go, what? Wow, my life has really changed because I didn't think about that. It's just my occupation, meaning what occupies me now. I'm not writing. And and then I realized actually the truth is if I had to do this again, I would just write the word son because that's really, I wasn't being a social worker I had no credentials. I was except as their son who needed help. And so I went from a writer, editor to caregiver to just your basic son doing what needed to be done, which I did feel kind of a need to give back because I felt very blessed by
Yeah.
what they had provided for me.
I read your essay. You referred to yourself as is it an ex-hippie or as a hippie? And so as you're describing yourself, your dad was kind of giving you a lifeline financially for a while, and now you have to come in and reorganize everything. So that's an interesting shift. And did you have, strong feelings about that or reactions to that? Or, I mean, it had to be a
Well,
shock to the system for sure.
I was around 61 and I remember having the thought, oh my God, when I hit 65, retirement age, I might have to start looking for work.
Mm,
The flip,
right.
flip of uh, but I've managed
Yeah, yeah.
other
I-
things.
I'd like to ask, because I had to do this myself, come in and take over the system of how the house is run, and everybody has their own little ways of doing and managing these things. What was your father's reaction to your coming in and revising his system? Was he aware of that?
He was in the throes of the beginnings of a traumatic brain injury. He couldn't make change. I watched him in occupational therapy in the rehab, and my heart was sinking when they said, if I give you this $5 bill and I want single dollars back, how many would you give me? And he was stumped. And this
Couldn't
was like
compute.
mathematical genius.
Oh,
So I don't think he had feelings. He just had needs at that point.
Okay, so there wasn't any blow up or
No,
strain over that. Because that's what I experience, at times, strain over taking over things that like that my mom did.
Y-
So that was good in a way.
what you just described is, I had a very similar experience with my dad. He was not, he was very good mathematically. He could do everything in his head. That was kind of his thing. But he had a stroke at 60, and what he really lost at that time was that ability, that I don't know if it was just mathematical ability, but that kind of thinking. And he couldn't. My dad never used a calculator for things, and he never used a calculator to figure out the tip at dinner. And I would see him struggle with this, and it was so hard to watch this person who was so quick-witted, quick with his ability to calculate and think through things, suddenly not be able to do something that was so easy. And so I'm hearing that a little bit in what you're saying with your dad. It's like, I imagine watching that was hard as his son. Here he is, this mathematical genius, and he can't make change from a five, and that's horrifying, right? And it's hard to see.
the silver lining there was when he was first in rehab and the head doctor came in for the initial introduction, and it was a woman, and she shouted in his ear. He wasn't deaf, but
Hmm.
they shout at everybody, assuming they can't hear you. She said, "Max, do you know where you are?" And he said, "Yes." "Well, where are you?" He goes, "I am in a quandary."
Oh my God, I
And in
love
that
that.
moment, I realized, okay, Dad's still in there. And
Hmm.
then she pointed to, I was there with his best female friend, who was an old student. He goes, "Do you know the name of the two people in the room?" He said, "Yes." "Okay, can you tell me the names of the two people in the room?" He said, "Yes." He goes, "Well, can you tell me their names?" And he goes, "The answer to your question is yes." He could tell her the name. She wasn't asking for the names. So his
Oh,
humor was present. And then when he got home, he fortunately recovered about 75% of his mental faculties, not enough to run the house or do math, but to converse. And, he was himself again in many ways. Um,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
one day he was hard of hearing. So whenever I was upstairs and Shari, my wife, was in the lower room, I would yell, "Shar!" And every single time my father would hear, "Dad." So he would answer, "What? What, El?" And I said, "No, I was calling Shari." And this got really tiresome. So I brought Shari, my father, and the aides into one room, and I said, to make this easier, I'm going to give Shari a new pet name. So it's really easy. From now on, her name is Peaches. So let's test this out. Shar, go downstairs. Shar, and without missing a beat, my father says, "Yes, darling."
Oh gosh, that's
So he
great.
had he had his humor,
that is
and
cute. What a cute story.
humor is
So
90% of the battle sometimes.
yes, for sure. And you mentioned the silver lining. And so a lot of people, when they're confronted with these diagnoses, immediately see the doom and gloom. And life is over and it's nothing as good is going to happen again, but we know better. So can you talk about the silver linings?
I I will, and that's really the whole book. But
Mm.
at first, my close friends would very cautiously ask me timidly, with a forlorn look on their face, does your mother still know you? Because that's
Mm,
what everybody hears about. And I was thinking to myself always, I don't really know who I am. What do I care if she does?
mm,
But to them, if I said no, that was the most horrible thing they could imagine.
mm-hmm,
But what I was discovering is that there was a sense of connection on a soul to soul, heart to heart, essence to essence level that had nothing to do with whether she knew my name, if she knew I was her son, if she knew what a son is. There was a connection there that we both recognized. And in fact, it was much more clear than it had been my whole adult life. I had struggled with her a lot, um, and never felt totally relaxed myself or loving in her presence. But that just, it dissipated. As I went to a psychic early on and said, I think my mother's losing her memories. And she said, psychic said, I think your mother's going to be a lot happier without her memories. And it was
mm,
true because she had not been she was a Holocaust survivor, was not a happy person a lot. She brought a lot of fear genetically and experientially into the house. So when she started dropping those memories, and what emerged was the little girl she must have been that I never met. She was laughing and loving and radiant. She always looked 15 years younger than she was. And she became this beautiful angelic being in our midst.
mm,
And I mean, that was the major silver lining, is to notice that, yes, Dad, the woman who was your partner for 70 years is slowly fading out of your life. But let's see who is here, because I was a little less attached to the one who was leaving, and I was very interested, fascinated by this new person in our house. It was still my mom because we felt the connection, but she had no other, you know, similarities to who we expected. Different taste buds, different habits, totally different personality. And I loved, it was her childlike nature, and I loved it. And all
wow.
any kind of tension from our adult lives dissipated. And we had kind of a
Mm,
mini love affair for about 10 years.
That's
wow, that's so beautiful. I
it's
love that.
fascinating. It's fascinating. And the way you describe it is she lost what must have been really horrific memories, and that trauma that she was carrying for so long.
Mm,
Oh my God.
Yeah, she truly was, in the sense that if we were watching television, the Dick Van Dyke Show or something harmless, but a commercial came on that had a newsreel for some reason showing Hitler giving a big speech or the soldiers goose stepping like that, she would panic. And it looked from the outside like she was having an LSD flashback. And my
mm,
father would jump up and turn the station. And I was a little kid. I had no idea what that was about, but it gave me an ominous sense that there was something there, which I wouldn't learn about for about 30 years, what I had been watching, maybe a little less. But
Did you not know that she had been a Holocaust survivor? Was that not something she talked about? I'm just
There was
curious.
no, there was dead silence on the matter for most of my childhood. I learned about it later with a lot of help from her younger brother, who was a lot more open and younger, so he didn't go through it as much.
So your mother has this transformation, and it brings up this other piece of her that I love the way you describe it. You had this love affair with this new person, and that's so beautiful. And I like Marianne. I really love the way you show the silver lining in the tough stuff, because there's always another side. It's we don't need to sugarcoat it and bright side it and say, oh well, look at the bright side, but just also seeing there's a possibility for an opening here for something else. And I think that that's a wonderful way to look at
You
it.
can't get to that. I call it's a reframing of a situation, but there's no way you can reframe it realistically, authentically, until you've gone through whatever you need to go through to let go and experience the loss. But if you can get yourself there to accept, to the level of acceptance of the loss of your loved one, that can open your brain, your mind to the reframing where, well, but wait, there's this person who's still here, you know, and
Right.
I think about it as like a mother with a newborn child. There's no language. The child has no name. There's no shared memories or language. There's just this intuitive, instinctive, deep bond. And that was what I rediscovered. We didn't need language, memory, or names because the bond was still there underneath it all. And that was really great to discover. So one of the mantras of the book is connection is everything. Yeah.
Well, I think that's sort of the dilemma so many dementia caregivers fall to without any kind of understanding of what might be happening. We want to correct. And I think it comes from a place of maybe hoping that if we correct, we'll fix it. You know, we'll fix this memory loss. If we fix this memory loss by constantly correcting them, then they won't have dementia, right? And yet the connection is more important. So I often say to folks, connection over correction. And I wanted to ask about your dad. How did he deal with his the love of his life having then falling into a dementia, Alzheimer's diagnosis, and what progressed from there? How did he manage that? And did you experience that with him, that he understood that and dealt with it, or was that a struggle for him as well?
Huge struggle. My mother was in denial at the very beginning when she was still mostly herself, but would do something weird. Like I had been in the park. Sherry and I were sitting on a park bench with her, looking at a beautiful egret on a pond. And we come home, which is 5 minutes away. She comes up to me a minute later and goes, "Did I tell you I saw an egret today?" And that was one of the first big like wake up calls for me. And if she had said that to my father, his intuitive response or instinctive response would have been, "Of course, I know you saw an egret. I was with you. We were both sitting on the park bench. Don't you remember? It was 10 minutes ago." And he did that over and over again, even as my brother and I would sit him down to gently try to explain to him that you can't, like you said, I love that connection, not correction. He was big on correcting until he finally saw the conflict he was creating in his own life. You know, because she would get nuts when he would yell at her for something she didn't understand. You know, like she had just had a 5 minute call with her sister, and then my dad referred to, how was your sister? She goes, "I don't have a sister." He goes, "What do you mean? You just got off the phone with her?" "What do you, I don't, I would know if I have a sister." And he goes, "Of course you have a sister. Her name is Gertie. You just spoke to her." And this is right after my brother and I had explained to him, just let her be right. Her reality is her reality, and it's as real for her as you standing here on this floor is real for you. And you can't impose your reality on her. And she would do what a lot of Alzheimer's patients do, which is get anxiety and go, "I want to go home." And my father's response was, "You are home. This is your home." And I would like walk into the room, take her by the elbow and go, "Ma, come on, let's go for a walk. I'll take you home." And we'd walk out of the room. I was trying to teach my father without teaching him. And we'd walk out of the room, and there was a picture on the wall of all her relatives, dead relatives. And she just would get intrigued and start pointing to each one and telling me stories, totally forgot about going home.
Yeah.
So that, and I learned that they call that redirecting, but I wasn't
Right.
doing, I learned that by myself. I didn't know that.
Oh, go
I'm
ahead.
wondering about the relationship between you and your brother. How did that come together to help your parents?
My brother was, we both had difficulties with our relationships with our mom, most of our certainly teen life, and it persisted even as we got more mature and tried to be good sons, but the feelings were difficult. And so he had told my mom early on, makes him sound like a monster, which he wasn't. But at one point I heard him say, "I'm not going to do this for you. You're going to go right into a nursing home," which is a horrible thing to say to your mother. But as it happened, he came around to the point of it was a 7 hour drive for him, but he would come down once a month to visit, and we'd be on the phone every other day to consult about any number of things, doctors, medications, where to get a hospital, but everything. He helped a lot. Um, and we became closer as well over this. But there was a very touching moment when my father finally died. We were both home. It was the afternoon. We were on either side of his bed holding his hand, and he went out fairly peacefully. And I went downstairs to the living room while my brother said his goodbyes. And when my brother came down, he had in his hand, he had this engagement ring that my father had not removed from his finger in close to 70 years. And we had not discussed this. There were no words. He just reached out, uh, indicating I should put my hand out, and he slipped it on my finger. And other than just now, it hasn't moved from my finger either. And I just felt it was him telling me, I know I wasn't here the way you were, and I thank you for what you've done. It was very touching.
Mm, that's beautiful.
Mm. Thanks for sharing that story. I had a question about caring for someone with dementia in their 90s and how that can be different than caring for somebody that's much younger, because now they may have accumulated a number of comorbidities and frailties. What was your experience with that? Did that ever make a difference to you that
Well,
people in their 90s, they're just like weaker and can be more frail?
my mother was in remarkably good health. Um, she had swam 3 times a week, and on the other days went for walks, and extremely careful with her diet. She read Prevention magazine, so only egg white omelets, and
Mhm.
this was a low fat period, so everything was low fat. She
Mhm.
took really good care, and everybody would guess that her age was 10 to 15 years younger than it was. And even to the day she died, she had very few wrinkles. I mean,
Mhm.
I've seen pictures of like indigenous people, and you would think they were 190, but they were really my mother's age or younger. Anyway, so she did not have comorbidities. In fact, my brother, she had a advanced directive, the usual 3 things, no feeding tube, no artificial respirators keeping me alive, and a do not resuscitate order. And my brother wondered, because in his mind, she was having a miserable life with no quality. In my mind, I was there, she was not suffering. She was not
Mhm.
physically suffering, and she wasn't mentally suffering. As far as I could tell, she smiled, and especially in the earlier days, smiled and laughed all the time, was very warm to people. So I thought this is not a time to end her life on purpose, because he was saying next time she gets pneumonia, maybe you should ask her doctor if we should just not treat it, because the Alzheimer's community says pneumonia is God's gift to the elderly, like it's a
Mhm.
way out. So I asked her visiting doctor, a woman from India, and she got a little brusque with me, but I appreciated it. She said, "Your mother's vital signs are perfect. Her blood work is perfect. There's nothing wrong with her. As long as she's like this, we're going to keep treating. She's not actively dying, and she's not a candidate for hospice." So that's all the things that I felt. So
Mhm.
she actually didn't get on hospice till 2 days before she died at 95, almost
Mhm.
96.
Yeah, that's remarkable, because I think a lot of people might have that same feeling. And we did a just film discussion just yesterday with Frank Silverstein, and he brought up the same points, about, well, why the question was, how do you let your parent continue to live like that? Which was kind of horrifying. That person was, trying to suggesting that he should kill his parent. And he was like,
Yeah,
well, they're having a good day, so, well, it's not going to be today. And then the next day, well, he's enjoying his day today, so it's not going to be today. It's like, well, when is it? I mean, as long as they're comfortable and they're happy, and that's what it's about. We can't hasten it, even when they have pneumonia. Now, I had a patient when I'm a nurse, and I'll keep this brief, but the 95-year-old man, and he had pneumonia, and his wife came into my office and said, why is my husband still alive? And I said, what do you mean? She says, my husband has an advance directive. He doesn't want to be treated with antibiotics.
Mm.
So I raised the question to the doctor, and the doctor was like, well, we can cure his pneumonia. And I said, but you can't cure the Alzheimer's. And she says this isn't what he wants.
Mm.
So we had, it turned out to be a big deal. I ended up getting in big trouble for even suggesting that to the doctor. But eventually, she had her way, and they put him on like just comfort measures only, and he did pass away.
I mean, my brother suggested that treating pneumonia which was simple. It was a squirt of a syringe in
Exactly.
her mouth.
Mhm.
He wondered if that was a heroic measure, according to her advance directive, and I set him straight on that because there was nothing heroic about
No, heroic.
little squirt in the mouth.
Right. Yeah, it is a conundrum. There was a book that we had in our office. It was called Hard Choices for Loving People. It was a booklet. It was something like maybe 30 pages. So we had them to give to people like in that situation. So I had given the woman the book. And boy, that doctor, went down to my boss and reamed me out. How dare I give this book to this woman because I was interfering with his care plan. He didn't want to have a patient die of pneumonia on his watch. That was what it was about. It wasn't about the patient or the situation. It was about him. So I understood that, but that is a common perception that a lot of people have, is that people are suffering. And so why do we prolong the suffering? But in reality, most people, they're not suffering. It's more like we're suffering.
I mean, it can go the other way. I've known people whose parents didn't become more and more sweet and open and loving, quite the opposite.
Right.
That's got to be a really difficult, different situation. And usually they can't keep them at home if they're like that. As many patients as there are that many stories and nuances. And I
Exactly.
didn't think for a moment that my book was going to relate to every family. But I point that out in the book, and I say, despite that, there are things here that could like assist you along the way in how you interact with them.
Absolutely. And so, I would love to invite you, if you have something that you'd like to read from your book, could we hear a passage that you think would be helpful for people to hear?
The first page must make sense since it's the first page. Let's see.
That'd be good.
Yeah.
My mother, Manya Sobel, passed from this world in 2019 at the age of 95 after a grueling 20-year journey into the utter oblivion of Alzheimer's disease. We were very fortunate, or some might say crazy, to be able to care for her at home the entire time. My father, Max, was her sole hands-on caregiver for the first 8 years until he finally surrendered to my brother Harry's and my pleading that he allow a home health aide to begin helping him. Even then, for a full year, he only permitted someone to come for 2 hours each morning to help get mom bathed and dressed for the day. Soon, however, his aide needed an aide because it required two people to prep my mother, one to gently restrain her while the other cleaned her up and put her clothes on. Without that second person, mom would resist the process by pulling the aide's hair, grabbing and tugging at her earrings with great force, punching and kicking. And my brother Harry and I had to listen through the bathroom door as my elderly dad attempted to do this on his own for way too long before he finally admitted and recognized it was just too much for him. That's just it's framing the story.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Can you explain the title now? Because I love the titles. The Silver Lining of Alzheimer's, One Son's Journey into the Mystery.
Yeah, well, there were there were so many books. I mean, you guys are an exception, and things have changed since then. But back then, there were so many books and podcasts. Maybe they hadn't started yet, but books and radio shows, I guess, and articles that were basically tragic stories, heartwarming, tragic stories. But I noticed in our household, there was laughter every day from something mom said or did. And it brought a lot of joy into the house. Suddenly, I would put music on and I saw my parents dancing in the living room, which I hadn't seen ever. And especially for me, there was a deep healing that happened where my heart flew open and without it. I'd been trying to fix this in therapy my whole life, and suddenly it just effortlessly vanished, any barriers to love. And so love filled the room for me in particular, and for my dad eventually as well, but it took him a bit longer to get on board. So that was the main silver lining. The other one was what I already talked about, going through the stages of grief, and this would apply more to my dad, that once he could let go finally that he had lost his partner, he couldn't talk sensibly to her. Well, everything was gone. She didn't always know who he was. Um, but the silver lining was once he did his grief process, which takes as long as it must for each person, he was able to open to this like startling discovery that there's this really interesting, nutty, funny, loving person in the household that we'd never met. Um, it was like getting inside the fantasy world, which for her wasn't fantasy, and just seeing what another imagination is like. Can I just tell you one little or two little anecdotes about my mother that
Sure.
indicate the kind of humor that she was bringing to us? We'd be sitting at the kitchen table. She had a salad. She picked out a piece of lettuce, put it on the table, and then smoothed it out with her hands like she was ironing it until it got as flat as she could make it. Then touched it and looked up at us and said, "This is not a normal person." And I told that story to a friend of mine and goes, "Well, you
Oh,
know what? She was absolutely right."
wow.
Yeah.
And a lot of little moments like that were what were so precious.
Mhm.
The example I give is if you were babysitting a 4-year-old girl and she said, "When I grow up, I'm going to be a princess and live on Mars." You would not like say, "Honey, you can't be a princess unless you marry royalty, and Mars does not sustain life." That's not how you babysit. You
Mm.
join in her imagination and you build out the story, and that's how it was with my mom in some ways. So that was another silver lining. And the main one was, like I said before, is connection, to rediscover the importance of connection. And even after 70, 80 years, the unimportance of all the content. How important is it that she remembers my name or where we went when I was 12? Or how important are all the stories, the linear story, her personal story, our personal story? How important was that if we now had this feeling of, a connection we would have loved to enjoy our whole lives? I was just grateful it finally came at the end and lasted
Mm.
at least 10 years of her process or more.
That's amazing. That they lived so long too, because if they hadn't, then that would never have happened.
Right.
Yeah, that's amazing. You've written some other books for people with dementia. Can you tell us about them?
I'll give you the backstory. It's
Ooh,
called
how pretty.
Blue Sky, White Clouds, um, a book for memory challenged adults. And what it is my idea was to create a book that had a single, realistic, recognizable, beautiful picture
Mm-hmm.
page with a large caption in big print, short caption in big print. This says the little yellow bird, for example. So what happened was
Beautiful.
my mother had lost, as far as we knew, she had lost all language. And that's a whole nother story. The progression of how language works in an Alzheimer's patient was fascinating. But we thought her language was done. And then one day I walked into the living room and she was flipping through a magazine and reading the big headlines, 3 words, 4 words out loud. I thought, whoa, mom can still read. It's amazing. So I ran out to Barnes and Noble to look for a book for memory challenged adults. No such thing. I looked through Amazon and the internet, no such thing. I finally called the National Alzheimer's Association. They put me in touch with their chief librarian, a woman named Mary. I asked her for what I wanted, and she was quiet. And then she said, well, we have 20,000 books here for the people caregiving for dementia patients. I said, no, no, I'm not talking about for the caregiver. I want something for my mother to keep her occupied and that she can deal with or understand. And she was stumped. Eventually, she thought of one name, and Lydia Burdick, who had put out a few books. I bought them, and the aides read them to my mother every day, about 40 times. But it was not the book I wanted because it was animated, cartoonish, which my mother is not that into.
Mm-hmm.
The captions were 2 long lines, and it was a story, so you had to track it. The difference in this book is she could open it to any page without any memory. That was the main selling point. This book requires no memory. So if you find a picture you like, whatever it is, my mother would, this says a blue lake by the mountains. Here's one she really liked. She would look at it for 10 minutes straight in silence, caressing the page. Well, this picture of the elderly couple, can you see it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And it just says they have been married for many, many years. And she picked out of all these pictures, she picked out about 5 that she would spend a lot of time with. And it gave them an activity. That was my main goal, was to give the aides and my dad something to do with her, because
Right.
all they were
Mm-hmm.
doing until then was parking her in front of the TV and playing a DVD of the Dean Martin Comedy Hour that she had seen 100 times. Of course, it was new to her every day. She loved this one too, The Little Children.
Oh,
Oh, I love that.
I do want to point out that we have an author, Laurette Clyer, who has a series of books similar to that, but they are all like familiar patriotic pictures, or they may be familiar song lyrics. And that is really a beautiful series of, I think maybe she has 9 or maybe a dozen of those. But your book and her books would be so useful in
Mm-hmm.
care communities for caregivers to be, as you say, engaging with someone instead of just sitting them in a corner.
We
Yeah.
we we also have another author, and that's Susan Ostrowski, and she has a program called Reading to Connect, and she actually produces pieces much like what you just showed us. She's a reading specialist and speech pathologist, and very much like what you've just shown us. Picture on one side, some very short text on another page, and it doesn't have to go in any order. You can open it up wherever, and you have one page with text, one page with a picture, and you can interact right there. So it's a lot of people do lose the ability to read as they fall further into their dementia as it progresses. This is what she's trying to do, is help people be able to do that as an interaction thing. It's that connection piece that you talked about. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Some pictures would bring up a conversation or a reminiscence. Sometimes it would be silent.
Well, I find this really fascinating, and I love that you are sharing it with us because, we'll definitely put links to those books as well because I think those are so helpful for folks. How else can we find you? How do we find you? How do people find your book? And
To find the book, it's simple. I made a website for it. I didn't, but it's called LMEpress.com. ELEMI, LME Press, one word, LMEpress.com. And that'll take you to a summation of what we just talked about of the book, some pictures of my parents and myself, and a way to get, you can either download it right there or order it on Amazon. And then if you want to know more about me, I have a bigger website because I actually had another life before all this called EliezerSobel.com. And that's hard to spell. So they'd have to ELIEZER Sobel, SOBEL.com.
well, we will have both in our show notes.
Thank you so much. It was really a pleasure to meet you, and I loved hearing your story and learning about your parents and your experience. And I'm sure many of the listeners will gain a lot of knowledge and inspiration from you.
Thank you so much. Very nice to meet you. And
Thank all of you also.
Thank
Uh,
you.
I appreciate you including me in your amazing little growing project.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
thank you.